Plenty of videos exist on YouTube exploring the core elements of Breath of the Wild. Whether it's breaking down its graphical components, delving into its open world design, or cracking open the series' deep lore, it seems like every gaming channel out there has at least one video dedicated to this game. And it makes sense. It's a game that ended up defining a genre, and plenty have tried to emulate its style. So today, we'll be taking a look at one of my favorite elements of Breath of the Wild, an element that defines this entry in the series, the element of video games that stick with us for years and even decades: the sound. And we'll be looking at the sound from a player's perspective. I'm not going to sit here and pretend to be a sound engineer or designer, but as a longtime gamer and video game soundtrack connoisseur, I'm really excited to share my perspective with you on this game. So think of this as an appreciation video more than anything else. And I'm going to be breaking this video into three main parts: atmospheric sounds, musical themes, and sound effects. If you were watching analyses or gaming reviews when Breath of the Wild first came out in 2017, you probably noticed that many creators had strong opinions about how bare the game sounded. We're used to being treated to ultra-memorable musical motifs from this series, and so its sudden disappearance only heightened players' awareness of its absence. Starting from the title screen. Games in this franchise have had ultra-memorable title screens since forever. They're the player's first impression of what to expect from the game, and are an important part in informing the player about what they are going to experience. And suddenly, with Breath of the Wild, it was missing. But this was an intentional choice made on the developer's part. By having a silent title screen, the players started the game with a blank slate. And once players spent more time in the game and realized the themes present, the muted sound palette made more sense. We were looking at a Hyrule fallen into disrepair, still suffering the ravages of the Great Calamity. They were at a stalemate with the war effort thanks to Zelda's sacrifice. And that desolation was well reflected in the atmosphere of the sound design. Nature sounds prevail. In the rustling of leaves and swaying of grass, it reflects the unrelenting march of time regardless of the Hylian's struggle. You quickly realize what a perfect pairing the sound design is with the artistic styling. The soft, layered sounds of the piano over these ambient soundscapes complement the soft, idyllic visual composition of the landscapes. The worn ruins whose harsh edges have been scrubbed away after over a century of exposure, the rustic villages that shelter the region's people, the serene landscapes devoid of civilization, all underpinned by thoughtful soundscapes and minimalistic melodies. It becomes apparent after a few hours how full and robust orchestral pieces would be at odds with the bare and skeletal remnants of this Hyrule. And because Breath of the Wild is an open-world game, its restrained use of its music and sound effects increases their impact without overstaying their welcome. Imagine having to listen to the same piece of music for hours on end while you explore this huge open-world game. Instead, the field theme remains unobtrusive and never reaches critical mass in terms of repetitiveness. They accomplish this with the overworld theme by having either the treble or bass clefs playing varying riffs at randomized intervals. This always provides a unique experience during the long stretches of exploration. The music acts as an accent to the ambient sound design, which lends an air of authenticity to this vast world that has been created. The music breathes. And just like human breaths are not perfectly paced, but vary, so too does the overworld's music. It catches, it hangs, it quickens and slows, complementing the tempo of the player's playstyle excellently. Even though Breath of the Wild uses a light touch, its orchestral compositions are phenomenal. Much like the geography and lore harken back to previous games in the series, so too does the music. But unlike the geographical references, the compositional callbacks are much less overt. If you're not paying attention, it's easy to miss them entirely. So hey, listen. Did you hear that? If you listen closely, you'll hear 3 familiar notes. Longtime Zelda fans will recognize these notes as Zelda's lullaby. They've been slowed down and strung out as if they are old, worn out, and tired. These are the only times you will hear these particular arrangements. If you never rode a horse in your playthrough, you missed them entirely. And during a nighttime ride, we can hear the hero's theme very clearly. Many of these musical Easter eggs are from long-standing entries in the franchise, from as far back as the original Legend of Zelda for the NES. Many of them, however, will be familiar to you because of the most famous entry in the series, Ocarina of Time for the N64. The stables scattered across Hyrule, the Horse Shrine, and Cass, the Wandering Minstrel, all have adopted Epona's theme, or a derivation of it, in some way. I remember during my first playthrough when I first discovered the Dueling Peaks stable and heard this for myself. I was absolutely delighted to hear some of my favorite motifs making a reappearance in this game. And that theme of discovery and delight continues as you become more and more acquainted with this version of Hyrule. There are memories of melodies no matter how familiar you are with the series. The Rito Village is reminiscent of Dragon Roost Island from Wind Waker. But we don't always get one-to-one musical references like we do here and in other areas such as Kokiri Forest. Sometimes it's the use of particular musical sounds that makes a callback to a previous game in the franchise, such as the use of brass horns in Goron City, which harken back to their introduction in Twilight Princess. Hyrule Castle pulls in musical motifs that have been present throughout the franchise, an awesome culmination for the end of the game. The composition for this area acts as almost a historical record, a medley of classic themes presented in a new and interesting way. And every time I come back to this area, I feel like I'm hearing something I missed during my initial playthrough. Probably because I was in panic mode the whole time. This particular riff, for example. I think I only started hearing it recently, now that I'm more comfortable in my ability to explore the area and I can slow down and enjoy the experience. But this kind of storytelling isn't only present in the middle and late game. From the very beginning, the game has been sprinkling in these reimagined riffs of jingles and tunes from throughout the series. It subconsciously connects you to this game and makes you feel sort of nostalgic right off the bat. One of my favorite Easter eggs, though, is from the very beginning of the game. I didn't realize it was even there until about my third time playing through the opening sequence. Listen to the jingle that plays when you meet the old man after activating the Sheikah Towers. It's so obviously the king's theme, which I remember most vividly from The Wind Waker. The game is letting you know who this character is in a really subtle way, long before you find out his identity at the Temple of Time. All of our wistful remembrances of past titles and their music only underpins the whole experience of the game. I would argue that some of these musical choices are pretty overt. For example, in Terrytown, we have the evolution of its theme presented as each resident moves in. This kind of reminds me of the main theme from Link's Awakening, where you have to gather every instrument to play the Ballad of the Windfish. As you find the necessary residents to grow this town, the music becomes more fleshed out as well. Each race contributes their own unique sound to the growing theme. The Gorons add their horns, the Gerudo their sitar, etc. It's quite possible you may not have noticed these changes if you were rushing through the game. And it's this kind of polish that Zelda fans have come to expect from the franchise. The care and dedication shown to aspects of the game that may go completely unnoticed by players only highlights how far this game stands above others. Discovering these little riffs of melody interwoven into these new compositions creates yet another layer of enjoyment and satisfaction for the hardcore Zelda fan. But it also serves a more philosophical purpose. The fragmented, half-missing melodies gives the player a glimpse of just how far removed Breath of the Wild is historically from previous iterations. It emphasizes the sense of time that has passed between it and other games in the franchise. Most importantly, the music informs the player about their current situation. The bulk of the musical scores only play in areas where you are either safe, i.e. in towns, shrines, or stables, or when you are in imminent danger. One of the reasons you're always caught off guard by the start of a battle is because the game uses the same composition, but in a handful of different key signatures for these altercations, each complementary but different. And since you're never 100% sure which one you'll hear, your brain never quite catches up. But in addition to this subtle use of sound design, we also have some really memorable pieces. The iconic skittering treble notes that play whenever a guardian spots you likely gave many a player palpitations. It's definitely the kind of thing that sticks with you. And the persistent pounding of the bass notes reminds me of a predator stalking its prey. Each overworld mini-boss has a distinctive tune that fits their design and battle styles as well. The Talus theme opens with a percussion section reminiscent of pebbles scattering across the ground. Big brass sounds and deep resounding percussion highlights in my mind the denseness of these monsters and their heavy gait. The Hinox, on the other hand, has a more tribal feeling somehow. The time signature is harder to wrap my head around, and when the brass section comes in, it has a jazzy, fumbling cadence that reflects the lumbering physicality of these beasts. The Molduga theme is interesting in that it has two parts that mirror the battle phases. The first being the driving beat that reminds me of a shark swimming in open waters. And the second only playing once the beast becomes vulnerable. The second part of the theme somehow manages to reflect the manic dash to attack these monsters before they retreat to the safety of the sand below. And while the town themes are slower and calmer, these battle themes are faster in tempo, likely reflecting your heartbeat and creating a sense of urgency and dread. With this in mind, the relative lack of music while exploring, particularly on foot, highlights the vacuum and the room for possibilities. This is best displayed by the incomplete chord structure used in the overworld theme. Listen to this chord structure. The ambiguity of whether this is a major or minor chord contributes to my thesis. The player is able to interpret it however they want. A minor interpretation would contribute to a feeling of sadness, while a major interpretation would lend itself to a more upbeat feeling. The game designers intended to leave room for the player to feel whatever they wanted to feel, whether that's the melancholic calm of passing by various ruined settlements, or the tension of sneaking past an enemy. The choice to allow room for an ambient soundscape in the game facilitates those feelings. That's not to say that the sound design is unable to elicit specific feelings. My favorite example of this is the creepy vibes that the musical theme of The Lost Woods provides. It's very different from the upbeat themes we've heard in past games. The Kokiri Forest theme is a slower version of the one that you are acquainted with from Ocarina of Time. Its new cadence now lends itself to a sprightly, more Fey-like feeling. The Kokiri Forest theme in particular is one that I think gets overlooked quite a bit. I don't think players realized that this was a slowed down version of the one we heard in Ocarina of Time. I didn't realize it when I first heard it. It takes a moment to realize once again that these notes echo old musical motifs that we know and love. Close your eyes and think about some of the music from your favorite games. Chances are that you remember the overworld theme, the desert theme maybe, the music playing when you first started out on your adventure. Breath of the Wild has managed to inform the player about their surroundings without necessarily falling into tropes that exist for video game music, like how all snowy areas in games seem to use sleigh bells for some reason. And yet the volcanic areas sound volcanic. The snowy tundra imparts an icy chill, and those thunderstorms slap. This is one of the few times we're treated to purely ambient sound without music. The tension built when a thunderstorm descends on you, and the relief felt when the music finally returns after its passing, is a masterclass in player manipulation. All throughout this game, the music communicates the lore of this franchise in an elegant and unparalleled way. If you haven't watched the cutscenes from the Memories Quest and DLC, I recommend you do so, as there are some pieces heard here that don't seem to exist anywhere else. Like, they literally composed these pieces to be heard probably one time in this very specific circumstance, and there are a lot of players who have never heard them.
It's just asinine.
It's not called the Ballad of the Champions for nothing. And it's at this point that I realized that as players, we'd been had. Nintendo cheated. By weaving together these melodic Easter eggs into their game, they simultaneously tapped into our love of nostalgia and sense of history, creating these strong ties between games of decades past and Breath of the Wild, they were able to amplify the theme of age and decay. And I'm not mad. It's honestly brilliant. A whole video could be dedicated to searching out and exploring the usage of these melodies, but I think that would diminish your enjoyment of the game. I think too many people got the impression that Breath of the Wild was a quiet game, and then proceeded to ignore the rich musical history this game encompasses. I do hope you are able to find more of these Easter eggs for yourself on your next playthrough. Both the ambient sounds and musical themes act as two halves of a single but beautiful whole. But there is one more aspect of Breath of the Wild soundscape that goes grossly underappreciated, and if done poorly can break a game's experience: the sound effects. The level of care put into the game's sound effects is made apparent from the very beginning. From the moment Link emerges from the Chamber of Resurrection, you can hear it. You can hear the nuances of traveling over the stony path versus on grass or in water. Even climbing produces gentle scuffing sounds as silt and pebbles fall from beneath your hands. Link himself, the ever-silent protagonist, also has a litany of orations that reflect his actions: the grunt of exertion, the satisfactory laugh after creating an edible meal, the whistle to call your trusty steed. If you look at the combat section in any game review, chances are you'll find the content creator talking about sound design in some way. Players want the feedback of combat to feel genuine, and that includes how different weapons sound. Light weapons should sound like light weapons, and clubs should sound like clubs. The Master Sword is probably the only sound effect gripe I have in this whole video. I don't understand why it sounds like we're beating on a giant tin bell whenever we use it, and it's mixed so loud. I have to wonder if this was Nintendo's attempt to keep people from using it by accident without realizing it. I'm not really sure. But the sound design goes even deeper. From the kinds of armor you wear to the amount of noise you make while wearing them, the game goes beyond just mixing the same sounds higher or lower to convey stealth or caution, but actually records fresh audio that would reflect this. Breath of the Wild does an excellent job of conveying the properties of a weapon through their sound effects, even down to the draw of a bowstring. But my favorite sound effects by far come courtesy of Kakariko Village. The wooden clackers reminiscent of Japanese ema strung throughout the village are just gorgeous. The paddling of the water wheel being powered by a gentle stream, the coziness of the fire in the center of the village. All of this works together to impart a certain feeling to me as a player. It's a feeling of loneliness and solitude. And most of the game has this textural sound design. From the larger grains that make up the bulk of what we will likely remember from the game, such as the music, to the finer granules like velvety soft footsteps and the pitter-patter of rain. Part of the reason I have dumped several hundred hours of my life into Breath of the Wild is because I enjoy being in this world. There's no possible way I have actually stepped foot on every square inch of the map, and every time I feel up for exploring or finding Koroks now that I'm post-game, I'm greeted with delightful soundscapes and music that flows in a dynamic way. Sometimes I like to just go stand somewhere for a quarter hour and see what sounds float my way, and that is a beautiful feat for any game to accomplish. I hope you enjoyed this video discussion about Breath of the Wild's sound design. If you did, please leave me a thumbs up on the video. I would greatly appreciate it. Leave a comment down below about your favorite sounds in this game or in video games in general. I look forward to making more content like this, but until the next video, sweet dreams.